The cold wind sliced through the streets of the poor neighborhood like invisible blades. Abel, an elderly black man of 78, felt every gust as a harsh reminder of his age and his worn-out bones. He tightened his coat around himself with trembling hands, clutching onto the few belongings he had left. His small suitcase, a paper bag with documents and a few old photos were all that remained of his life. He was still in shock. He had been evicted without warning, without compassion. The door to the tiny apartment where he had lived for over 20 years was now locked forever. His old tired eyes welled up as he tried to process what had just happened. Mrs. Veronica, the woman who owned the building, hadn't even given him a chance to negotiate his rent payment. He was a few weeks late, yes, but the icy tone with which she had ordered him out still echoed in his ears. "I'm tired of waiting, Abel. You have until the end of the day to leave my apartment. I'm renovating it to rent at a much higher price, and frankly, I don't have time to waste on people like you. Before we start the story, I'd like to know what city you're watching from. Tell me in the comments, and I'll leave a heart for you." Those words, as cold as the winter wind, lodged deep in his heart. Abel felt the sting of humiliation coursing through his veins. He had tried to explain, to tell her that the delay in rent was due to an unexpected expense on medication, but she hadn't even looked at him. Now, as he walked away from the building that had been the only place he called home, he felt the crushing weight of loneliness and helplessness. Abel wandered aimlessly, his steps slow and heavy as he clutched his old coat tightly around him. The streets were nearly empty that afternoon, and he felt like a ghost adrift in the world. In the central square, a young woman recognized him and stopped, her eyes lighting up with the memory of her childhood lessons with him. "Mr. Abel, I remember you. You changed my life," she exclaimed, leaving a few coins in his hand. She smiled gratefully, but her smile cut Abel deeply, leaving him ashamed. A man who had lived with dignity all his life now found himself relying on the charity of others. He kept walking, heart heavy, feeling the growing despair wrapping around him like a shroud. He stopped at a bench in the square, staring up at the grey sky and the fallen leaves around him. As he tried to gather his thoughts, he carefully opened his suitcase, almost as if any sudden movement would shatter the memories inside. As he sorted through his belongings, he found an old faded envelope with smeared letters and a name he didn't recognize, Valerie. Abel frowned, trying to remember if he knew anyone by that name, but nothing came to mind. He opened the envelope, his trembling hands revealing a letter written decades ago. The paper had yellowed with age, and the inked letters had a melancholy tint. In the letter, a woman confessed the anguish of a cruel decision forced upon her by her family. The letter spoke of a baby given to another woman to raise in love, far from the eyes of a judgmental society. Abel felt a chill as he realized that the letter seemed to tell the intimate story of his origins. He had never known who his biological parents were. He had been raised by a kind woman whom he called Mom, though she always avoided discussing his real family. Each line he read made his heart beat faster, and he felt a strange mixture of hope and anguish. The letter mentioned a certain Mrs. Victoria Albright as someone who could explain more about his past. He was suddenly struck by the realization that Victoria Albright was the same name as the wealthy woman who had mercilessly evicted him. He took a deep breath, shaken by the strange coincidence that seemed to be a twist of fate. It all felt surreal, but the letter seemed to be the missing piece in the puzzle of his life. Resolving to seek answers, he set off for the address written at the end of the letter, unsure if he had the strength to face the woman again. Victoria Albright's mansion was a monument of wealth in the heart of the city. Abel stopped in front of the imposing iron gate, feeling the stark contrast between that world of luxury and the humble places he had always known. Taking a deep breath, he pressed the doorbell. After a few minutes, the door opened and Victoria appeared, looking at him with surprise and irritation. "What are you doing here, Abel? Didn't I make it clear that there's nothing left between us?" she asked, her voice sharp and impatient. Abel held up the letter, his gaze fixed on her with a mix of sadness and defiance. "Mrs. Albright, I found this letter among my belongings. It mentions someone named Valerie, and from what I read, it seems you might know something about my origins. I just want the truth." Victoria's face went pale, and for a moment, the mask of cold indifference cracked. She reached out for the letter but hesitated. Her eyes revealed an internal struggle, a mix of panic and pain. Abel watched every detail, noticing that the mention of Valerie affected her more deeply than he had imagined. "Yes, Abel, I knew Valerie," she murmured, her voice trembling slightly. "She was my sister." The revelation hit Abel like a blow to the chest. He was speechless, struggling to process what he had just heard. The woman who had turned him out so ruthlessly was his aunt. He, a man who had always felt alone in the world, had a family, but the only person left from that family was someone he never would have imagined. The silence between them was almost tangible. Victoria looked away, fighting the emotions stirring within her. Finally, she took a deep breath, trying to regain her composure. Valerie was my sister, yes, but she made choices our family couldn't accept. When she fell in love with a black man, she was cast out. Victoria's voice was strained with bitterness and regret. When you were born, she was forced to give you up to another woman. It was the price we paid to keep our family's honor. Abel felt a wave of rage and sadness so overwhelming that he could hardly breathe. He stared at Victoria, searching her face for any hint of regret or humanity. She seemed torn by the confession, but Abel realized that guilt alone wasn't enough to make up for a lifetime of rejection. "Do you know what it's like to live your whole life not knowing where you came from? Who your parents are?" he asked, his voice thick with emotion. "You and your family stole from me the chance to know my mother, to have a real home. And now, all that's left are words on an old piece of paper." Victoria remained silent, her eyes fixed on the ground, unable to meet Abel's piercing gaze. He could see a flicker of pain, maybe even regret, but it did nothing to change the fact that she had cast him out without a second thought. "I'm sorry, Abel. I'm so sorry for everything," Victoria whispered, almost inaudibly. What would happen next? Abel didn't know. All he knew was that somehow fate had led him to this woman, who now seemed caught between arrogance and a glimmer of humanity. And as he turned to leave, he felt that his journey was far from over. Abel's footsteps echoed down the grand marbled hallway of Victoria Albright's mansion. His heartbeat thrummed in his chest, each beat a bitter reminder of how surreal this moment felt. This woman, who had evicted him without a second thought, was his aunt. The elegant chandelier hanging from the ceiling, the gilded mirrors on the walls, these symbols of wealth mocked him as he sat down, reminded that the comforts of this life had been denied to him since birth. Victoria's face was pale as she took a seat opposite him. Her polished appearance, her immaculate pearls and flawless posture all suddenly seemed like a mask, something too perfect, too constructed. In her eyes, however, Abel could see it, a flicker of something fragile and broken, a trace of guilt she'd long buried. "Abel," she began, her voice hesitant, laced with a bitterness she could no longer hide. "I've spent years hiding this part of my past, burying my family's shame and yours. But I see that now I can't avoid it anymore." She swallowed, eyes narrowing as if trying to put him at a distance. "Yes, Valerie was my sister. She was my younger sister, wild, free-spirited, and too naive to see the dangers around her." Abel's hands clenched. Naive, is that what you call loving someone? Was her only sin falling in love? Victoria flinched, but her face hardened. She fell in love with someone who would ruin her. Our family had high standards, Abel. My father, he built his wealth from nothing and demanded that we uphold our family's reputation. Valerie's romance with a black man, it was unthinkable. Unthinkable? Abel's voice shook with fury, every word coming from a well of decades-old pain. Do you understand what it's like to be cast aside, left to fend for yourself without a family or a past? While you had the luxury of your father's wealth and protection, I was left with nothing but questions. Victoria lowered her gaze, and for a fleeting moment something softened in her eyes. You're right, Abel, she murmured. You're absolutely right. But I was young too. We were all bound by my father's control. He demanded obedience. To him, love didn't matter. Social standing did. She rose from her chair, her stiff posture and cold demeanor crumbling as she began to pace the room. Valerie was different. She defied him in ways I never dared. She was passionate, reckless, and she didn't care about appearances. Victoria's voice broke. She loved your father with all her heart, but my father would never have allowed her to keep you, so he made her give you up. He sent her away, stripped her of her inheritance, her family, of everything. Abel felt a wave of anguish surge within him. You knew, he whispered, barely able to contain the despair in his voice. You knew all this time that I was alive, alone, and yet you never sought me out. You left me to live as a stranger, deprived of any sense of belonging. Victoria stopped pacing and turned to face him. I wanted to find you, she said softly, almost pleading. After my father died, I did try, Abel, but by then I was trapped in a world of obligations, and you You were a reminder of a past I thought I could bury. My father's shadow loomed large, even after he was gone. Convenient, isn't it? Abel's voice was laced with bitterness. The past stays buried until it's inconvenient, and now you face me as if you're the victim in this story. But it was you who condemned me. You were complicit in erasing me. Her shoulders slumped, and for a moment the composed, unbreakable woman Abel knew shattered before him. She took a shaky breath, clutching her hands together as if trying to piece herself back together. I was weak, Abel. I admit it, she said, her voice barely a whisper. I hid behind my father's cruelty, his prejudices, because I was too afraid to stand against him. I chose the easy path, the path of wealth and privilege, while you paid the price. An agonizing silence fell between them, thick and suffocating. Abel fought to steady his breathing, a whirlwind of emotions raging inside him. He looked around the room at the expensive artwork, the delicate antiques, the opulent fixtures, each one a reminder of the life he'd never known, the family that had deemed him unworthy. Tell me, he said finally, his voice thick with pain, was it worth it? Was this fortune, this legacy of yours worth the sacrifice of your sister and your own nephew? Victoria's lips trembled. She reached up, as if to touch him, but her hand froze mid-air. I don't expect you to forgive me, she said, her voice barely audible. I don't deserve it, but I want you to understand. I'm not the same woman I was. I can't erase the past, but I want to try and make amends. A bitter smile tugged at the corners of Abel's lips. Make amends? He repeated, disbelief lacing his words. After all this time, you think a few words will make up for a lifetime of loss? Victoria swallowed, her hand falling limply to her side. Maybe words aren't enough, Abel, she admitted, but actions can be. I want to help you now. I want to give you a chance at a better life. Abel let out a harsh, bitter laugh. A better life? At this age? After you've stolen my life from me? He rose from his chair, his body trembling with anger. I don't need your money, Victoria. I needed a family. I needed my mother. I needed a past that wasn't tainted by lies. He turned to leave, each step heavy with the weight of all the years he'd spent searching, waiting, hoping for something he'd never had. He was nearly at the door when he heard her soft voice behind him, broken, vulnerable in a way he'd never thought possible. Abel, please don't walk away, she whispered. Let me show you that I can change, that our family's story can still be rewritten. He paused, hand on the doorknob, his heart torn between anger and a glimmer of something he could barely understand. The years of bitterness and loneliness, the constant wondering about his past. They were like shackles around his soul, and for the first time he wondered if this encounter might be the key to freeing himself. Without turning around, he spoke, his voice weary, but less harsh. If you really want to make amends, Victoria, then prove it. Tell me about her. Tell me everything you remember about my mother. She inhaled deeply, and her eyes misted over as memories surfaced, memories that had been locked away for years. Valerie was full of life, Abel. She laughed, she dreamed. She would sing to you every night, cradling you in her arms, and when she looked at you it was as if you were her entire world. Victoria's voice trembled with the weight of the memories, her own bitterness dissolving into sorrow. She wanted so much for you. She fought for you right up until the end, and when they took you away it broke her heart. She left us not long after. She died alone because we failed her. A single tear slipped down Abel's cheek, the ache of his mother's absence cutting through him like a knife. He closed his eyes, picturing a woman he'd never known but had longed for every day of his life. Victoria took a tentative step toward him, her face etched with remorse. You were her everything, Abel. And I am so sorry that I couldn't be the sister she needed. I betrayed her, and in doing so I betrayed you. I can never take that back. But please, let me try to give you something, a place where you can belong. Abel's hands trembled as he opened the door, turning to look at her one last time, his voice choked with the remnants of a lifetime's worth of pain. I may never forgive you, Victoria, but maybe I can forgive her through you. With that, he stepped outside into the cold, leaving her standing there watching him go, a woman burdened with the weight of a lifetime's worth of regret. Abel walked down the winding path away from Victoria's mansion, his thoughts tangled in a chaotic storm of emotions. The revelation of his mother's love for him, her relentless fight for his existence, had ignited a fire in his heart, a fire that Victoria's coldness had almost extinguished. His mother, Valerie, had loved him deeply. She had sacrificed everything for him, and yet here he was, left to face the emptiness left by her absence. For years he had wondered why he felt incomplete, like a man missing a crucial piece of himself, and now he understood. His mother's love had been stolen from him, erased as if it never existed. A week passed, and Abel tried to carry on with his life, each day blending into the next. He returned to the temporary shelter he had found, his meager possessions packed in the corners of a room shared with strangers. Sleep became a distant memory, each night filled with haunting memories and questions that clawed at his mind, unanswered. The life he had thought he knew was nothing but a story constructed around someone else's shame. And yet, despite all this, there was an undeniable sense of curiosity that pulled him back to the Albright mansion, like an invisible thread connecting him to a woman he barely knew. One frigid morning, just as dawn was breaking, Abel found himself walking back toward the mansion. His pride rebelled, fighting against the very notion of asking Victoria for more truth, more fragments of his mother's memory, more of the life he had been denied. But his heart, yearning for closure, guided his reluctant steps. Victoria was waiting for him, almost as if she had known he would come. Dressed simply, without her usual layers of elegance, she looked different. A hesitant smile touched her lips as she saw him approach, her posture softer, almost vulnerable. She led him to the study, where a crackling fire fought against the biting chill of winter. They sat in silence, and Victoria turned to him, her eyes filled with a sorrow she could no longer mask. "Abel," she said softly, "I never wanted to be the monster in anyone's story, but I was. I was cowardly and selfish. I let my family's rules define me. I let them steal away my sister, and through my silence I allowed them to rob you of her love." "Why?" Abel's voice, rough from years of silence and recent anger, filled the room with the weight of that simple question. "Why did you choose to let it happen? You had a choice, Victoria. You could have helped her. You could have saved us both." Victoria lowered her head, unable to meet his piercing gaze. "I was afraid," she admitted, her voice barely above a whisper. "Afraid of what people would say, of how our family would be seen. My father's expectations, they were like chains around my heart. I told myself that by staying silent, I was protecting myself, but in doing so, I destroyed the person I loved most." Her confession was raw, each word spilling out as if it had been locked away for years. Abel could sense the fracture in her soul, a crack where her heart had once been. She looked up at him, eyes glistening, no longer the formidable woman he had once known, but someone stripped bare of all pretense. "After Valerie left, I tried to forget her. I tried to tell myself that her choices were her mistakes. But I knew, deep down, I knew. I was haunted by the memory of her laughter, her defiance, her refusal to bend to our father's will, and I hated her for it. I hated her for being free, for choosing love over everything else." Victoria's voice broke, and she turned her face away, ashamed. Abel watched her, torn between anger and an inexplicable pity. This woman, whose name alone could command respect and fear, was now reduced to a shadow, consumed by regrets that she could never undo. "And now what do you expect me to do?" Abel asked, his tone a blend of bitterness and sorrow. "You expect me to forgive you? To forget a lifetime of loss? My mother's love was stolen from me, Victoria. She was erased from my life, and I was forced to grow up in a world that never wanted me." Victoria nodded slowly, her hands trembling. "No, Abel, I don't expect your forgiveness. I know I don't deserve it, but I want to help you, truly help you. Not to ease my own guilt, but to give you something real. Valerie would have wanted that." Abel's expression softened, despite the anger simmering in his chest. "And how do you plan to do that?" he asked, his voice laced with skepticism. Without a word, Victoria rose from her chair and crossed the room to a locked cabinet. She opened it, revealing an old, dust-covered album, its pages filled with photographs that had been hidden away for decades. She returned to him, placing the album in his hands with a tenderness he had never thought her capable of. "This belonged to Valerie," she said, her voice filled with a reverence that startled him. "She left it here when she was forced out, and I couldn't bear to look at it. It was a reminder of what I had done, of the love she shared with you." Abel took the album with trembling hands, his heart pounding as he turned the first page. He was met with a photograph of a young woman, her features strikingly familiar. Her eyes, bright with defiance and joy, stared back at him, and he felt an overwhelming surge of emotion. This was his mother, Valerie, a woman he had never met, yet had yearned for all his life. He flipped through the pages, each photo like a fragment of the love that had been hidden from him, Valerie smiling, holding a newborn in her arms, her eyes filled with a warmth that radiated through the worn photograph. Tears blurred his vision as he realized that this woman, this fierce, beautiful woman, had fought for him, had loved him with a ferocity that transcended the years they had been apart. "She was always proud of you," Victoria whispered, her voice thick with emotion. "Even when our father forced her to leave, she held on to the hope that one day you would know the truth. She wanted you to be loved, to be cared for, to live a life free from the chains that bound her." Abel looked up at her, his face wet with tears he had never allowed himself to shed. "And yet you took that from me," he said, his voice choked. "You kept me from her, from the family I should have known." Victoria nodded, her own tears falling silently down her cheeks. "Yes, I did, and I'll never forgive myself for it. But I can't change the past, Abel. I can only offer you this, her memory, her love, and whatever part of my life you'll allow me to share with you." The silence between them was filled with the weight of the years lost, of the lives irreparably altered by choices made in fear and prejudice. Abel closed the album, his heart aching with a strange mix of loss and acceptance. He couldn't deny the truth of what Victoria had said. She had wronged him in ways that words could never undo, yet here she was, offering him the only pieces of his mother that remained. "I don't know if I can ever forgive you, Victoria," he said finally, his voice heavy with the burden of his pain, "but I can't deny the truth either. Valerie was my mother. She loved me, and that's something I need to hold on to." Victoria nodded, a small hopeful glimmer in her tear-stained eyes. "Then let me help you, Abel. Let me give you the life that Valerie would have wanted for you. A home, a family, a place where you belong." Abel studied her face, searching for signs of deception, but all he found was a weary woman, burdened by her mistakes, longing for a redemption that might never come. He took a deep breath, the bitterness within him slowly ebbing away, replaced by a reluctant acceptance. "I will take this album," he said quietly. "I'll hold on to her memory. But as for you, I don't know if I can ever truly accept you as my family." Victoria nodded, her shoulders slumping with the weight of his words. "I understand, Abel, and I'll respect whatever you choose, but know that my door is always open. I'll do whatever it takes to make up for the years we lost." He gave her one last, lingering look, his heart torn between anger and a flicker of newfound understanding. Without another word, he turned and left, clutching the album to his chest, the memory of his mother, finally, painfully, his, to cherish. Abel walked back to his shelter, clutching the album like a lifeline, a fragile reminder of the mother he had never known. Each step felt like a journey through time, unraveling fragments of a life that could have been his, if not for the Albrights' lies. The weight of those stolen memories filled him with an ache that no amount of time or apologies could ever erase. But he was finally carrying a piece of Valerie with him, her presence tucked safely between the pages, giving him something solid to hold on to. Once back in the cramped space of his room at the shelter, he sat on the edge of his bed, opening the album again, flipping through each photograph with a reverent touch. Here Valerie smiled in the sunlight, her expression radiant with the kind of joy that only came from pure love. In another, she held him as a newborn, her gaze so tender it brought fresh tears to his eyes. For the first time, he didn't feel entirely alone. He could feel her spirit surrounding him, offering him a love that had been stolen by decades of silence and betrayal. But as he closed the album, a new sense of resolve washed over him. The Albrights had buried his mother's legacy, reduced her to a painful secret they had locked away in a forgotten corner of their gilded lives. His anger returned, sharper, yet somehow focused. He had spent a lifetime being quiet, accepting the world as it was handed to him. Now he knew that he couldn't leave this chapter closed, not without a proper reckoning. 2 days later, he stood once more at the steps of Victoria's mansion, a steely determination in his eyes. She met him at the door, her expression laced with surprise, and led him into the same sitting room where they had last spoken. Her gaze held a trace of hope as she watched him settle into the armchair, clutching the album tightly. "Victoria," he began, his tone unyielding, "I don't know what kind of life you've led. I don't know what made you believe that burying the truth was the only way to survive, but I know now that I can't let it go." Victoria's face paled, her lips pressing into a thin line. "I understand, Abel, and I'll support whatever you feel is right. But please understand that this story, if it goes public, could ruin what remains of my family's name." "Your family's name?" Abel repeated, his voice thick with disbelief. "Do you even hear yourself, Victoria? My mother is dead because of that name. She died alone, cast out by the same people who now fear a little damage to their reputation." His eyes blazed with a fury she had never seen before, a fury that was long overdue. Victoria's eyes fell, her hands twisting in her lap. "You're right," she whispered. "I have no right to ask anything of you, but please know, Abel, I loved Valerie in my own way. I was weak, trapped in my own prison, and by the time I realized what I'd done, it was too late. But if you're here to expose the truth, then so be it." Abel watched her struggle with the enormity of her guilt, her hands clutching her armrests as if to ground herself. He took a deep breath, steadying his voice as he continued. "I'm not here for vengeance, Victoria. I'm here to bring justice to my mother's memory, to restore the dignity that your family stole from her. If that means revealing the truth, then yes, the world should know what she suffered for love." Victoria nodded slowly, her face a mixture of resignation and something else, a faint glimmer of relief. "I want to help you do that," she said quietly, her voice wavering. "Let me help honor Valerie's memory. It's the least I can do." Abel's eyes softened, just a little. He wasn't certain he could trust her, but he knew that Valerie's story deserved to be told. "Then let's begin by telling it together. Tell me everything you remember about her, everything your family worked so hard to hide." Victoria took a shaky breath, her gaze distant as she delved into her memories. "Valerie was everything I wasn't. Fearless, passionate, full of life. She loved music, art, and people. Our father disapproved of her because she wouldn't conform to his image of an Albright. When she met your father, she fell in love instantly. I remember the way her eyes would light up when she talked about him. Her voice softened, filled with a sorrow that seemed to age her years in seconds. He was a musician, wasn't he?" Abel asked, his heart clenching at the thought. Victoria nodded. "Yes, he played the piano beautifully. Valerie once told me that the first time she heard him play, she knew she was destined to love him. They would meet in secret, their own little world hidden from the rest of us. When she found out she was pregnant, she was overjoyed. But my father saw it as the ultimate betrayal. He wanted her to get rid of you, but she refused. So he disowned her." Abel swallowed hard, his fingers tightening on the album. He could almost see it. His mother standing defiantly against a man who held all the power, a man willing to sacrifice his own daughter to protect his precious image. "And you? You did nothing to stop it." "I was afraid," Victoria said, her voice breaking. "I was a coward, Abel. I should have stood by her, fought for her. But I let her go because I couldn't bear the thought of losing my place in this world." She looked up at him, her eyes shimmering with unshed tears. "And that's my greatest regret. I chose myself over my sister, and by the time I understood the depth of my mistake, she was gone." Abel felt the rage bubbling within him, but he forced himself to listen, to hold on to the image of his mother's love rather than the bitterness of her loss. He wanted to hate Victoria, to cast her out as she had once cast out his mother, yet he knew that Valerie, the woman who had loved so fiercely, wouldn't have wanted that. "Then let's honor her," Abel said, his voice softer though still unyielding. "Let's give her the legacy she deserves. She was more than your family's shame. She was a woman who loved and lived with everything she had. The world deserves to know her name." Victoria nodded, wiping a tear from her cheek. "You're right, she deserves that much, and I will do whatever it takes to make that happen." Together, they began to discuss ways to share Valerie's story. Abel suggested establishing a foundation in her memory, one that would support young artists who lacked the means to pursue their dreams, just as his father had been a struggling musician. The foundation would carry Valerie's name, a tribute to the life and love she had sacrificed. As the days passed, Abel found himself returning to the mansion regularly. Each visit brought with it new stories, new fragments of Valerie's life that Victoria had kept hidden away. Despite himself, Abel began to see Victoria in a new light. She was no longer the cold, distant woman who had thrown him out. She was a person bearing the weight of her own choices, a woman who had made grave mistakes, but who was willing to face them, willing to change. They worked tirelessly, building Valerie's legacy piece by piece, bringing her story back to life. For the first time, Abel felt a strange sense of peace, as if he was finally honoring the mother he had never known. He was giving her the recognition that had been stolen from her, and in doing so, he was finding a place for himself too. One evening, after a long day of planning, Victoria looked at Abel with a soft, hesitant smile. "Abel, I know that nothing I say will ever make up for what I did, but thank you. Thank you for allowing me to be a part of this." Abel met her gaze, his heart conflicted. "I'm not doing this for you, Victoria. I'm doing it for Valerie, for my mother." He paused, feeling the weight of the words he was about to say. "But I see now that you're not the woman I thought you were. I can't forget the past, but maybe I can forgive you one day." Victoria's eyes filled with tears, and she gave him a trembling nod. "I'll wait as long as it takes, Abel. I just want to be worthy of that forgiveness." In that moment, Abel realized that he had finally broken free from the chains of his past. He had reclaimed his mother's memory, found a sense of belonging, and perhaps in time he would find it in his heart to forgive Victoria. For now he was content to hold on to Valerie's love, a love that had transcended decades and heartache, and know that her story would live on. The Foundation's launch day arrived with the kind of quiet excitement that hung heavy in the air, a tribute to Valerie's life and dreams. Abel stood at the edge of the modest stage, his fingers brushing the polished edges of the old album he had kept close throughout this journey. His mother's memory had been pieced together through the fragments of stories, the faded photographs, and the hauntingly beautiful notes his father had once played. Today was not just a tribute to her, it was his first chance to finally give Valerie the recognition she had been denied. The Foundation's small gathering was held in a gallery, its walls adorned with artwork and photographs by young, emerging artists whose lives had been touched by Valerie's story. Artists from backgrounds that mirrored her struggle, her defiance. Abel could feel her presence in every corner of the room, in each hopeful face and every trembling hand holding a paintbrush or a violin. The young creatives, eager to share their work, had drawn strength from a story they barely knew, yet could deeply feel. Today, Valerie was alive again, her love and spirit echoing in every heart she had unknowingly inspired. At the front of the room, Victoria stood poised, waiting for her turn to speak. She had aged over the past months, her proud posture softened by the weight of guilt, humility, and the painful journey she had taken with Abel. Dressed simply, her makeup understated, she looked like a woman who had stripped away the layers of privilege to stand exposed before a crowd that knew the truth. For the first time, she was not the wealthy Albright heiress, but a sister seeking redemption, a woman who had chosen to defy her own past. Victoria stepped up to the microphone, her voice unsteady but resolute. She glanced over at Abel, their eyes meeting in a brief exchange of silent understanding. "Today we're here to honor a remarkable woman," she began, her voice carrying the weight of a lifetime's worth of unspoken words. "Valerie Albright was my sister, my better half in ways I could never fully appreciate until it was too late. She loved deeply, passionately, and against all odds. She lived for a love that cost her everything, a love that I did not have the courage to defend." Victoria paused, her voice cracking as she continued. "This foundation is a tribute to Valerie's indomitable spirit, her legacy that lives on in every artist and dreamer who dares to defy convention. Through your art, your voices, and your dreams, we hope to honor the fire that Valerie carried within her. We hope that her story can inspire you to stand up for love, for art, and for the truth, even when the world demands that you stay silent." A ripple of quiet applause followed, the audience visibly moved, many of them wiping away tears. Victoria stepped back, her head bowed, as Abel approached the microphone with measured steps, his hands trembling with emotion. He looked out over the crowd, his heart racing as he realized that finally, his mother's memory was no longer hidden in shadows. "Thank you, everyone," Abel began, his voice rough with gratitude and grief. "I grew up not knowing where I came from, wondering why I felt so alone. But today I stand here as a son, proud to tell you that my mother, Valerie, loved me fiercely. She was forced to choose between the love of her life and a family that rejected her, and she chose love. She gave everything for me, even when the world turned its back on her. This foundation is her legacy. It's a testament to her strength, her passion, and her unwillingness to surrender to a life without love." The room fell silent, each person absorbing the depth of Abel's words. He took a shaky breath, allowing himself to feel the love he had longed for all his life. "I hope that Valerie's story will remind all of you to be fearless in the pursuit of what you love," he continued, his voice resonating with conviction. "That even when it feels impossible, you hold on to your dreams, your truth, and your voice, because that is how my mother lived. She was courageous, even when her world tried to silence her." A few members of the crowd were openly crying, their hands clutched over their mouths, their expressions full of empathy and respect. Abel glanced at Victoria, who stood off to the side, her own eyes brimming with tears. She nodded at him, a silent promise of support and understanding. a pledge to uphold Valerie's memory for as long as she lived. The ceremony ended, and one by one people approached Abel, thanking him for sharing his mother's story. Young artists spoke to him with reverence, each one touched by Valerie's courage and Abel's tenacity. They shared stories of their own struggles, their own battles for acceptance, finding a newfound sense of hope in Valerie's legacy. Victoria watched as Abel engaged with each person, the anger and sorrow in his face softened by a tentative peace. As the crowd began to disperse, she approached him, hesitant, yet compelled by the need to express what she had been holding in her heart. "Abel," she said softly, her voice barely above a whisper, "I know this journey hasn't been easy for either of us, but I want you to know I'm so proud of you, and I hope that somehow I've done a little to honor Valerie's memory." Abel regarded her, his gaze steady but warm. "You have, Victoria, more than I thought possible. Today we gave her the honor she deserved, and maybe, just maybe, we both found a way to forgive ourselves too." Victoria nodded, her eyes glistening with gratitude and a bittersweet relief. "Thank you, Abel," she murmured, "for allowing me to be part of this, for giving me the chance to atone." As the last guests departed, Abel looked around the gallery, the walls adorned with vibrant paintings, black and white photographs and handwritten poems from the young artists inspired by his mother's story. It was a fitting tribute, one that seemed to pulse with the energy and life that Valerie herself had embodied. Victoria offered to walk him home, and they strolled side by side down the quiet streets, the winter air crisp, but not as biting as it had felt before. For the first time, their silence was comfortable, a shared moment of peace rather than a barrier between them. As they neared Abel's modest home, Victoria paused, a look of hesitation crossing her face. "Abel," she said quietly, "I know that I have no right to ask this, but would you consider visiting my home from time to time? I'd like to share more memories of Valerie, more of what I remember, if that's something you'd be open to." Abel studied her, his gaze softened by the day's events. The thought of entering that mansion again filled him with a lingering bitterness, yet he knew that Valerie's story was incomplete. He gave a small nod. "Perhaps. For Valerie's sake, I'd consider it." Victoria's face brightened, her eyes shining with a mixture of hope and humility. "Thank you, Abel. That means more to me than you'll ever know." They parted ways, and Abel entered his small home, the quiet comfort a stark contrast to the opulence of Victoria's world. But tonight, he felt a strange peace settle over him, a sense of closure he hadn't realized he needed. He walked to the table where he had placed his mother's album, running his fingers over the cover with a gentle reverence. He opened it once more, his gaze lingering on her smiling face, her arms wrapped around a baby. Him. In that photograph, he saw everything he had searched for: love, sacrifice, a sense of belonging. His heart swelled with pride and sadness, but for the first time he felt her spirit with him, not as a shadow of what could have been, but as a presence that would guide him forward. As he closed the album, he whispered softly to the stillness of the room, a quiet promise to the mother who had loved him with all her heart. "Thank you, Mom," he said, his voice thick with emotion. "I'm here now, and I'll make sure that the world remembers you, for who you were and for everything you gave me." And with that, Abel felt a quiet resolve take root, a new chapter beginning, not just for him, but for the legacy his mother had left behind. Months passed since the foundation's inauguration, but for Abel, it was as if the spirit of that day lingered in every step he took. His mother's memory, now so tangibly alive through the artists her story inspired, had softened the edges of his grief. Valerie's legacy was no longer confined to a forgotten album. It pulsed in the art and lives of those who, like her, loved fiercely and defied the constraints of their worlds. In the heart of the city, the Valerie Foundation had blossomed into a sanctuary for young creatives from marginalized communities, a space where voices too often silenced could find their strength and expression. Each time Abel walked through its doors, he felt his mother's presence woven into every inch of the space, in each brushstroke of a mural, in every note of a musician's practice, in the laughter and tears of young dreamers finding their way. This place was her, and he finally was part of it. Victoria remained an ever-present figure at the foundation, dedicating her time, wealth, and resources to its growth. She visited frequently, often working quietly in the background, her presence both dignified and humble. Over time, the children and young artists had grown fond of Miss Victoria, and she, in turn, found in them the kind of acceptance she had long craved. Abel watched her transformation, each act of kindness chipping away at the stern woman he once knew. revealing a version of her he could imagine his mother once loved. One afternoon, Victoria approached Abel as he stood in the gallery, admiring a new installation by a young photographer whose journey reminded him of his own. She paused beside him, her voice softer than usual. "Abel," she began, choosing her words carefully, "I want to thank you again, not only for allowing me to be part of this foundation, but for allowing me to rebuild myself too. I know it doesn't erase the past, but these last few months have taught me more than all the years of my life." Abel turned to her, his expression unreadable. "People can change, Victoria, but change doesn't come easy or without sacrifice. I'm glad you chose to honor Valerie's memory and that you've kept that promise. This foundation, it's what she would have wanted." Victoria nodded, her face softening with relief. "Yes, I think so too, and I would like to invite you to one more gathering if you'd allow it, to the Albright family estate." Abel's breath caught, memories of the grand mansion flooding his mind. The mansion, a symbol of the rejection and pain his mother endured, now seemed an impossible place for peace. Yet something in Victoria's gaze held him still, a quiet vulnerability. "We're opening the estate to the public," she continued, "transforming it into a gallery in honor of Valerie and her legacy. This will be the final event, the end of the Albright mansion as it was. If you're willing, I'd like you to say a few words, to give her the farewell she deserves." Abel's heart stirred, a mix of apprehension and gratitude. The mansion had once loomed over his memories as a fortress of rejection, but perhaps this was the chance he needed to face it, to reclaim it as a place of closure. He gave her a nod, his voice steady. "I'll be there." On the day of the gathering, the Albright mansion looked different on the day of the event, its heavy doors wide open, welcoming strangers and familiar faces alike. The walls, once lined with family portraits, were now adorned with paintings, photographs, and sketches by the artists of the Valerie Foundation. It was no longer a shrine to wealth and lineage, but a celebration of resilience, art, and love. Guests filled the grand hall, each step they took bringing life to a place once shrouded in silence and secrets. Young artists mingled with patrons, sharing stories and inspiration, their laughter filling the halls that had once echoed with cold formality. For the first time, the Albright mansion felt alive. Victoria took the stage first, standing at the grand staircase, her voice resonant and unwavering. She looked out at the crowd, each person a witness to her transformation, her journey of atonement. She took a deep breath before speaking. "This mansion was once a place where truth was hidden, where appearances were valued over love. But today, it's a place of liberation," she said, her voice carrying a quiet strength. "This is Valerie's legacy, a place where love and art triumph over fear and silence. This mansion will no longer be a symbol of the Albright name, but a place where her story lives on." With a respectful nod, she invited Abel to the stage, stepping aside as he walked to the microphone, the album of Valerie's photographs held close to his chest. Abel looked over the crowd, the faces blurred slightly by the wave of emotions surging within him. He took a deep breath, steadying himself as he opened the album to the first photograph of his mother, the image he had cherished since the day he found it. Raising his voice, he spoke with all the love, grief, and gratitude he had carried for so long. "Valerie Albright was my mother," he began, his voice rich with emotion. "She was a woman who defied every boundary, who loved with a heart so fierce that nothing, not even rejection or exile, could break it. She was a woman who chose love over comfort, who chose to keep me, to love me despite a world that wanted to silence her." His gaze swept over the crowd, his heart swelling with pride as he felt his mother's presence guiding his words. "Today we honor her. Today we make her story known, not as a tale of tragedy, but as a testament to resilience and courage. Her legacy lives in each of you who refuse to let the world dictate how you love, how you create, and how you live." The room fell silent, each person deeply moved, understanding that they were part of something greater than themselves. They were living witnesses to a story of redemption, a story of love that had defied even death. As Abel finished speaking, he felt a warmth envelop him, a peace he hadn't known he needed. He looked at Victoria, her face streaked with tears, yet glowing with the quiet relief of a promise fulfilled. After the ceremony, as the last guests drifted out, Abel lingered in the empty halls of the mansion, feeling the final remnants of his mother's presence. It was no longer a place of ghosts and shadows. It was Valerie's sanctuary, reclaimed and renewed. Victoria approached him, her expression one of quiet gratitude. "Abel, I know I've said this before, but thank you. I hope in some way that Valerie can finally rest, knowing she's been honored as she deserves." Abel nodded, his face softened by a gentle smile. "She's finally at peace, and so am I." They stood in silence, the echoes of the night's celebration fading around them, replaced by a calm stillness. For the first time, Abel felt complete, as if every piece of his story had finally fallen into place. In the quiet of the mansion, he realized that Valerie had never truly left him. Her love had always been there, waiting for him to uncover it, to claim it as his own. And now, with her memory alive and her story told, he could finally step forward, free from the weight of the past, ready to live the life she had fought so hard to give him. As he left the mansion that night, Abel felt the warmth of his mother's love surrounding him, a love that would guide him forward, forever unbroken. If this story moved you as much as it moved us, don't forget to like, share, and subscribe for more powerful narratives like this one. Drop a comment below. What was the moment that touched you the most? And if you had a second chance, what would you do to honor the memory of someone you love? See you in the next story.